The last of the half-drunk stragglers shuffled out of the dimly lit bar, their laughter echoing like a hollow mockery of the evening's failed performance. Harold Fletcher stood on the stage, his hand resting limply on his ventriloquist dummy, Benny. The spotlight had long since dimmed, and now only the faint neon glow of the bar's exit sign illuminated his face. The quiet creak of chairs being stacked against tables was the only sound in the room, aside from the bartender grumbling as he wiped down the counter. Harold sighed, lifting Benny with a practiced motion, though even that felt sluggish these days. His career had once shown promise, small-time gigs that brought in enough for rent and the occasional drink, but people's tastes had changed. His jokes, once sharp and quick, now fell flat. No one wanted to see an old-fashioned act like his anymore, and Benny, with his faded suit and cracked wooden grin, only seemed to amplify the sense of decay. With a flicker of muscle memory, Harold moved Benny's mouth, giving him a raspy voice. "Well, pal, looks like we killed tonight." Harold's lips barely moved as he replied in his own voice. "Killed our chances of ever getting a decent crowd again, maybe." "Can't blame them," Benny croaked, his painted eyes glaring out into the empty room. "Even I'm getting tired of you." Harold let out a bitter chuckle. That was the thing with ventriloquism. It allowed you to say things you'd never admit aloud. His bond with Benny had once felt like a partnership, but now the dummy's jokes cut deeper, like barbs lodged under his skin. Tonight, though, something in Benny's voice grated more than usual. He sounded too real, too cold. Shaking off the unease, Harold stuffed Benny into his weathered suitcase, snapping it shut. The dim bar felt suffocating, and he was more than ready to head back to his cramped apartment, his sanctuary, if you could call it that. As he walked out into the cool night air, Harold felt a flicker of paranoia prickle the back of his neck. It wasn't just his failing career that kept him up at night. There were other things now. Darker things. Harold's apartment was as run down as his career, a dingy one-bedroom in a crumbling building that stank of mildew and neglect. The wallpaper peeled like dead skin from the walls, and the single window let in little more than the distant wail of sirens from the street below. With a groan, he tossed his suitcase onto the couch and grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the kitchen counter. He unscrewed the cap, took a long swig, and let the warmth spread through his chest. But as he set the bottle down, something caught his ear. A whisper, faint and scratchy, like a voice carried on the wind. He froze, heart hammering. The apartment was silent. Too silent. "Just your imagination," he told himself. "You're tired, and you're getting paranoid. You're a grown man, for Christ's sake." But the sound came again, clearer this time. It was coming from the suitcase, from Benny. Harold slowly crossed the room, each step weighed down with a creeping sense of dread. He knelt before the suitcase, his fingers hovering over the latch, hesitant. The whisper was unmistakable now. Words, though distorted, were unmistakably coming from within. With trembling hands, he flipped the latch and opened the case. Benny stared back at him, slumped in his usual position. His glassy eyes reflected the dim light of the room. Harold studied the dummy's face, his mind racing. Could it have been a recording? Maybe he left a device in the case from an old routine? Then Benny's mouth twitched. Harold recoiled, nearly falling backward. He stared at the puppet, heart pounding, expecting, no, willing, Benny to move again. But nothing happened. The dummy sat motionless, its wooden grin frozen in place. The room was too still, the kind of stillness that made the skin crawl and the mind spiral into irrational fears. "You're losing it," Harold muttered, snapping the case shut and locking it this time. "You're completely losing it." He set the suitcase by the closet door and poured himself another drink, downing it in one swallow. But the whiskey did nothing to dull the prickling anxiety that gnawed at his insides. The apartment grew cold as the hours wore on, the kind of biting cold that sank deep into his bones. Harold lay on his worn-out bed, tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. His mind kept replaying the moment in the bar when Benny's voice had sounded different, sharper, and now that whisper, that horrible sound, echoed in his head like a taunt. It's just exhaustion, he tried to reason. Stress, whiskey, and a failing career. You're unraveling, that's all. But in the darkness of his room, that explanation felt paper thin. He glanced toward the closet where Benny's suitcase lay. The shadows in the corner seemed to deepen, growing thick and tangible, as if they were moving, watching. Then, out of the stillness, came the faint sound of creaking wood. The sound was subtle at first, barely noticeable over the hum of the street outside. But as Harold strained to listen, it became undeniable. It was coming from the closet. Harold sat up in bed, eyes wide. The creaking grew louder, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of something moving. His pulse quickened, blood pounding in his ears. He told himself to get up, to check it out. But fear held him paralyzed. And then, in the oppressive silence, the closet door slowly creaked open. No, this isn't real. Harold squeezed his eyes shut, his breath shallow and ragged. It's not happening. It can't be. When he finally mustered the courage to look, his heart seized in his chest. Benny was standing beside the bed, his head cocked at an unnatural angle, his small wooden hand clutched tightly around a gleaming kitchen knife. The sharp glint of the knife caught Harold's eye first, the soft glow of the moonlight reflecting off the blade in his pitch-black room. Benny stood at the edge of his bed, unmoving, but the sight of the puppet, lifeless and yet so clearly not, froze the blood in Harold's veins. He scrambled back, his mind a maelstrom of panic. This can't be happening. But there was no denying the reality before him. The dummy, that once felt like an extension of his own hand, now stood on its own, its painted eyes gleaming with something unnatural. For a brief moment, neither Harold nor Benny moved. Then, as if snapping to life again, Benny's head tilted ever so slightly, the hollow echo of wood grinding against wood breaking the silence. His mouth, that horrible wooden mouth, opened slowly, revealing the dark void within. A raspy, familiar voice slithered out. "We're not done yet, Harold." The sound made Harold's skin crawl. It was his own voice, or at least something close to it. But this time, the mocking edge had turned sinister. Cold sweat trickled down Harold's back as he stared at the knife, its handle so small, yet Benny's grip so steady, so sure. Harold felt like he was choking on the air in his lungs. With a frantic burst of energy, he lunged from the bed, knocking into the nightstand as he did. The lamp toppled, crashing to the floor, shattering into pieces. In the chaos, the room plunged into complete darkness. But Harold didn't care. He had to get out. Now his bare feet slammed against the hardwood as he bolted from the bedroom, racing toward the door. He fumbled with the locks, fingers trembling, and threw the door open. Stumbling into the hallway, he slammed it shut behind him and leaned against it, gasping for breath. His heart felt like it would burst from his chest. Every rational thought screamed at him that this was impossible, that this had to be some kind of nightmare brought on by stress, by alcohol, by anything other than the truth. But the image of Benny standing there with that knife, it was burned into his mind. He couldn't go back inside, not with that thing waiting for him. Harold spent the rest of the night huddled in his car parked outside his apartment. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, eyes darting nervously to the windows of his building, half expecting to see Benny staring down at him. But there was nothing, only the faint glow of city lights and the eerie silence of early morning. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, Harold's mind was still a jumbled mess of terror and confusion. He needed to talk to someone, anyone. But who could he tell? The police? He could already imagine the skepticism in their eyes, the laughter behind their polite smiles. A grown man afraid of his dummy? They'd never believe him. The morning came with grim news. As Harold drove into town, the radio crackled to life, announcing a string of brutal murders that had taken place overnight. The victims, the news anchor's voice said, had been killed in their own homes, stabbed repeatedly with surgical precision. Harold's stomach twisted. The description was eerily familiar to the way Benny had gripped that knife, poised and ready. He pulled over to the side of the road, feeling bile rise in his throat. Could it be Benny? Was the dummy really responsible for this? It was absurd, and yet the gnawing feeling of dread inside him wouldn't go away. Get a grip, Harold, he thought. It's just coincidence. Bad timing. Benny's just a puppet. This is something else. But when he glanced in his rearview mirror, his heart nearly stopped. In the back seat, slumped over and grinning that same ghastly grin, was Benny. Harold screamed, kicking the door open and tumbling out of the car. He stood in the middle of the street, breathless, staring in shock at the empty back seat. Benny was gone, just like that. But Harold knew what he saw. It wasn't just paranoia. Benny was following him. Hours later, Harold found himself sitting in his apartment, the blinds drawn, the place lit only by the dim overhead light. He hadn't gone to the police, not yet. What would he say? That his dummy was responsible for a murder spree? He took a long gulp from a fresh bottle of whiskey, trying to drown the pounding thoughts. He had to get rid of Benny. That was the only solution. Destroy the dummy and everything would stop. It had to. Harold grabbed Benny from the closet, his hands shaking as they closed around the puppet's stiff body, and rushed to the fireplace. He shoved Benny inside, stuffing crumpled newspaper around him, his breath coming in short gasps. He fumbled for a match and struck it, tossing it into the pile. The flames leaped to life, devouring the paper first, licking at Benny's wooden body. Harold watched, waiting for the fire to consume him, to burn the nightmare away. But as the fire grew, Benny's face, his grin, remained unchanged. The wood didn't blacken or crack. Instead, Benny's eyes seemed to glint in the firelight, almost gleefully. Then Harold heard the whispers again, low, hissing, and unmistakably Benny's voice. "You can't get rid of me, Harold. We're in this together." Harold stumbled back, eyes wide with horror. He watched, helpless, as Benny's body was pulled from the flames. No, it wasn't Benny moving. It was something else. Some force. The dummy was lifted upright, completely unscathed, its painted grin never fading. And in his hand, he was still clutching the kitchen knife. The next morning, the police were at Harold's door. "Mr. Fletcher?" The officer's voice was stiff, cautious. "We need to ask you some questions." Harold's mind raced. What had happened now? What had Benny done? The officer stepped inside, his eyes scanning the apartment. "There was another attack last night. Your neighbors. They were found dead. Stabbed multiple times." Harold's heart dropped. The blood drained from his face as he tried to form words. I didn't..." But the officer was already looking at something. He crouched down beside the closet door and pulled it open. There, stuffed in the corner, were blood-stained clothes. Harold's clothes. And Benny, grinning wide, sat beside them, the kitchen knife still clutched in his tiny wooden hand. The officer's expression turned grim. "Mr. Fletcher, I'm going to need you to come with us." Harold sat in the cold, fluorescent-lit interrogation room, his wrists bound by handcuffs to the steel table. The sterile smell of the room, bleach and sweat, clung to his senses, but it was the weight of the silence that threatened to crush him. His mind raced, a tangle of fear, disbelief, and growing dread. This can't be happening. Yet it was. The door swung open, breaking the heavy quiet. A detective stepped in, his eyes narrow, assessing Harold with the kind of cold scrutiny reserved for hardened criminals. His badge glinted under the harsh light, and behind him, an officer wheeled in Benny, propped up in a chair like some grotesque guest at the table. Harold's stomach twisted at the sight. The dummy's wooden face, now a fixture in his nightmares, stared at him with that frozen grin. But there was something more sinister in Benny's expression now, as if the puppet was silently mocking him. A sick joke only Benny understood. The detective sat down across from Harold, laying out a file filled with crime scene photos. One by one, he slid them in front of him. Each image was worse than the last. Bodies, mangled, torn open like animals at a slaughterhouse. Blood soaked everything, walls, floors, even the ceilings. Faces were twisted in terror, mouths frozen mid-scream. Harold felt bile rise in his throat. These people had been butchered. and the police believed it was him. His hands shook, the handcuffs clinking lightly against the table as he tried to tear his eyes away, but the detective kept pushing more photos toward him, pressing, digging. "All of these people were connected to you, Fletcher," the detective said, his voice as sharp as the knife Harold could still see in Benny's hand. "Neighbors, colleagues, even your landlord. You're telling me this is a coincidence?" Harold shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. He could feel the walls closing in. "I didn't do this," he croaked, his voice raw. "I swear, I didn't." The detective leaned in, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Then who did, huh? Your dummy?" The words hit like a slap, and Harold's breath hitched in his throat. He couldn't say it, couldn't make them understand. How could he tell them the truth? That it was Benny, that the puppet was somehow alive, framing him, haunting him. "They're gonna lock you away for this, Harold," the detective continued. "The evidence is all there. Blood on your clothes, the fibers from the dummy at the crime scenes. It's over." Harold's chest tightened as panic clawed its way up his throat. The walls felt like they were suffocating him, pressing closer with every breath. Benny's glassy eyes seemed to follow him, watching, waiting. He could almost hear the puppet's raspy whisper. "We're not done yet, Harold. You and me, we're just getting started." The hours bled together after that. They took Benny as evidence, leaving Harold in the cell, alone. But the whispers never stopped. They gnawed at his mind, echoing off the concrete walls of the holding cell, creeping into every corner of his sanity. Nights became a waking nightmare. The sound of footsteps outside his cell door growing louder, closer. He'd jerk awake, expecting to see Benny standing there in the dim light, holding a knife, that grotesque grin plastered across his face. But each time, the door remained shut, the hall outside quiet. Until one night, Benny finally came. Harold sat hunched on the small steel cot, running his hands through his hair. His thoughts were a disjointed mess. He barely slept anymore, and when he did, his dreams were filled with images of blood and Benny's laughter. But the sound that jolted him awake this time wasn't a dream. It was the heavy click of the lock turning. He shot up, heart hammering in his chest as the door creaked open. Standing in the dim glow of the emergency lights was Benny. No officer. No human figure. Just the puppet, standing on its tiny, stiff legs, the knife gleaming in its hand. Harold backed up until he hit the wall, his breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. His body screamed to run, to fight, but his legs felt like lead. The fear was too much. Too all-consuming. Benny took a step forward, his wooden joints creaking, the knife dragging across the floor with a soft, metallic scrape. "You shouldn't have tried to leave me," Benny hissed, his voice low, guttural. "We had a deal, Harold. You and me." Harold's voice was barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" Benny stopped, his head tilting to the side with a sharp crack. "I want you to finish what we started. I want blood. And I want you to help me." The words slithered through the air like poison. Benny took another step forward, the darkness seeming to thicken around him. Harold's mind raced, heart pounding. There was no escape. Not from this. Benny would kill him, just like the others. Unless... The horrible realization came crashing down on him. Benny didn't just want a partner. He wanted a vessel. He wasn't just framing Harold. He was preparing him. For something worse. Harold's body moved before his mind could catch up. He grabbed the metal cot and hurled it toward Benny with all his strength, sending it crashing into the puppet. Benny stumbled, the knife skittering across the floor, but his face, his grin, never wavered. "You can't get rid of me that easily," Benny sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "You and I are the same now." Harold ran. His bare feet slapped against the cold cement as he burst through the door, down the hall, and toward the exit. Behind him, the echoes of Benny's laughter chased him like a phantom. The guard at the desk was gone, blood smeared across the floor in his place. The world outside was blindingly bright, the city sprawling before him like an endless maze. But there was no time to think, no time to plan. He just needed to escape, to get away before Benny found him again. The police were in chaos after Harold's escape. He could see the flashing lights behind him, hear the sirens wailing in the distance. But none of that mattered. He knew Benny was still out there, following him, waiting for the right moment to strike. As Harold stumbled through the city streets, he could feel his sanity slipping further with each step. Every shadow seemed to hold Benny's shape. Every alleyway echoed with his twisted voice. Harold collapsed in the alley behind an old tenement building, gasping for breath, his heart racing. He couldn't outrun this. Benny was a part of him now, something dark and unstoppable. From the darkness, a voice spoke. "Harold!" He turned, his blood running cold. Standing in the shadows was Benny. But this time, Benny wasn't alone. The puppet had taken on something more. His figure twisted, bloated with darkness, his grin now stretched impossibly wide. He wasn't just a puppet anymore. He was something more. And Benny offered Harold a twisted smile. "Come with me, Harold. We'll finish what we started." Harold stared into Benny's empty eyes, knowing there was no escape. He had been chosen, bound to Benny in a way that could never be undone. As the city burned behind them, Harold felt his mind slip into that dark place, the place where Benny's voice was the only one that mattered. When they found the guard's body, hours later, they also found Harold's cell wide open, the bloody prints leading out into the night. And when they checked the security footage, they saw him, Harold, walking away from the station. But his shadow was moving in ways it shouldn't have. There were two shapes walking side by side. One was Harold, the other was Benny.